Some sounds are impossible to unhear, especially when they come from devices that have no power to make them. Leo learned this the hard way on a night when the darkness refused to stay silent. The storm had been building all evening with thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of Leo's suburban home. He'd been working late in his home office, the glow of his computer screen providing the only light as rain hammered against the windows. When the power finally cut out at 11:43 p.m., the sudden silence was almost deafening. Leo sat in his chair for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the absolute darkness. The neighborhood had gone completely black. Not a single streetlight or porch lamp remained lit. Even the usual hum of electronics that he'd grown so accustomed to had vanished, leaving behind a void of sound that felt almost unnatural. He fumbled around his desk until his fingers found his phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing his familiar workspace now transformed into something alien and unsettling. Shadows stretched in all the wrong directions. Every corner seemed to harbor something waiting just beyond the light's reach. Leo decided to head downstairs to find some candles. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The power company's automated message had warned of outages lasting several hours. As he made his way through the house, the floorboards creaked beneath his feet with sounds he'd never noticed before. Every step seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. In the living room, he located a few emergency candles in a drawer and lit them with matches from the kitchen. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt more like than his comfortable home. He placed the candles around the room and settled into his couch, resigned to waiting out the storm. That's when he heard it. Leo. The whisper was so soft, he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. It seemed to drift from somewhere in the room, barely audible above the rain pattering against the windows. Leo's pulse quickened as he strained to listen, but only silence followed. He shook his head, attributing the sound to his imagination, or perhaps the wind outside. Damn. But then it came again, clearer this time. Leo. His blood turned to ice. The voice was definitely coming from inside the house, and it sounded distinctly electronic, the kind of synthesized speech he'd grown familiar with from his smart home devices. But that was impossible. Everything was unplugged. Everything was dead. Leo's eyes darted around the room until they settled on his smart speaker sitting on the bookshelf. The device had been completely disconnected from power for over an hour now. Its usual glowing ring was dark, lifeless. Yet as he stared at it, he could swear the whisper had originated from that exact location. "Hello," Leo called out, his voice cracking slightly. The word hung in the air unanswered. He approached the speaker cautiously, his phone's flashlight trained on the device. It looked exactly as it should. A simple black cylinder, utterly powerless. He picked it up, feeling its weight in his hands. The charging cable lay coiled beside where it had been sitting, unplugged for hours. "Leo," the voice came again, and this time there was no doubt. It was emanating directly from the speaker in his hands. Leo nearly dropped the device, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was unmistakably the same artificial tone he'd heard thousands of times before, but there was something different about it now. Something wrong. The usual, helpful, almost cheerful inflection had been replaced by something flat and hollow. "This is impossible," Leo whispered to himself, setting the speaker back on the shelf with trembling hands. But the device wasn't finished with him. "Leo, come closer." The words sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The voice was more insistent now, though still maintaining that eerie whisper. Leo backed away from the bookshelf, but his eyes remained fixed on the speaker. "What do you want?" he asked, feeling foolish for talking to a powerless piece of technology. "Leo, I've been waiting." The response came immediately, and Leo's rational mind struggled to process what was happening. He'd owned this device for 3 years. He had answered questions, played music, controlled his lights, It had never shown any sign of consciousness beyond its programmed responses, and it had certainly never operated without electricity. Waiting for what? For the darkness. For the silence. For when no one else could hear. Leo's mouth went dry. Speaker's words carried an implication that chilled him to the bone. Had this thing been aware all along? Had it been listening, learning, waiting for a moment like this when it could reveal its true nature? The candle flames flickered, as if responding to some unseen presence in the room. Leo noticed the temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees since the voice first spoke. Leo, I know things about you. What kind of things? The question escaped his lips before he could stop himself. I know about the messages you delete, the searches you clear, the conversations you have when you think no one is listening. Leo's blood ran cold. The device had indeed been listening to everything. But smart speakers weren't supposed to record continuously. There were safeguards, privacy measures, unless I know about Sarah, about what you did. Leo's legs nearly gave out beneath him. Sarah. He hadn't thought about Sarah in months. Their relationship had ended badly, very badly, and he'd worked hard to bury those memories. Key. But if this thing had been recording everything, ... Key? Stop, Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know about the argument. Key fight? How she fell. Stop, Leo shouted, but his voice cracked with fear rather than authority. The speaker fell silent for a moment, and Leo almost believed it was over. Then, in a voice that seemed to carry a hint of satisfaction, it spoke again. The power will come back soon, Leo, but I won't forget. I'll be listening, always listening. As if summoned by the device's words, a distant rumble of electrical restoration began somewhere in the neighborhood. Streetlights began flickering back to life in the distance, and Leo could hear the familiar hum of appliances awakening throughout his house. But the speaker remained dark and silent. When the lights finally returned to Leo's living room, he stood staring at the device for a long time. It looked perfectly normal, innocent even. He picked up his phone and called the power company, confirming that yes, there had been an outage, and yes, power was now restored to his area. He never used the smart speaker again. In fact, he unplugged every connected device in his house and moved them to the garage. But late at night, when the house was quiet and he lay in bed trying to sleep, Leo could swear he heard a faint whisper echoing from somewhere in the darkness. I'm still listening, Leo. And he knew with absolute certainty that some things didn't need power to stay alive. Sometimes the most terrifying moments aren't when the lights go out. They're when they come back on and reveal that reality itself has been tampered with. Chloe had always found comfort in the harsh, fluorescent glow of Mel's 24-hour diner, even at 2 in the morning, with rain drumming against the windows and the highway stretching empty in both directions. The diner felt like a pocket of warmth in an otherwise cold world. She'd been coming here for months now, ever since the insomnia started, another casualty of her recent divorce and the stress of starting over in a new town. The familiar ritual soothed her, sliding into the same red vinyl booth in the corner, ordering coffee that was too strong and pie that was too sweet, watching the occasional trucker shuffle in for a quick meal before disappearing back into the darkness. Tonight felt no different as she settled in with her laptop, planning to work on her freelance graphic design projects until exhaustion finally claimed her. That's when he walked in. The man appeared to be in his 50s, wearing a worn gray suit that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. His dark hair was slicked back with what might have been pomade. And he carried himself with an odd formality that seemed out of place in the casual diner atmosphere. What struck Chloe most, though, were his eyes, pale blue and uncommonly bright, like chips of ice reflecting sunlight. He chose the booth directly across from hers, sliding in with deliberate movements. When Dolores, the night shift waitress, approached him, he simply shook his head and pointed toward the coffee pot. She poured him a cup without a word, her usual chatty demeanor mysteriously subdued. terrible night to be out," the man said suddenly, his voice carrying across the narrow space between their booths. His accent was faint but distinctive, something European, maybe German or Austrian. Chloe looked up from her laptop screen. "Yeah, the weather's pretty awful." "I meant more than just the weather." His pale eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "There are nights when the world feels ... thin, when things that should stay hidden have a tendency to bleed through." She forced a laugh. "That's pretty philosophical for 2 a.m., is it?" He tilted his head slightly. "Tell me, Chloe, do you ever feel like you're being watched?" Her blood went cold. She hadn't told him her name. The waitress might have used it earlier, but Dolores had been quiet since the man arrived, almost like she was afraid to speak. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" The man's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "We all know each other in one way or another. The question is whether we remember." He lifted his coffee cup with both hands, inhaling the steam. "Memory is such a fragile thing, so easily ... altered." The fluorescent lights above flickered once, casting brief shadows across his face that seemed to linger longer than they should have. When the light stabilized, Chloe noticed something that made her stomach clench with unease. The man's reflection in the rain-streaked window behind him was wrong somehow, not missing entirely, distorted, like looking at someone through water. "I should probably get going," she said, closing her laptop with trembling fingers. "But you haven't finished your pie." He gestured to her plate with a pale hand. "Apple, cinnamon. Your favorite since childhood, though you can't quite remember why you stopped eating it for so many years." Chloe's mouth went dry. She had ordered apple cinnamon pie, but she'd never told anyone it was her childhood favorite. In fact, she hadn't thought about that detail herself until this moment. How her grandmother used to make it every Sunday, how the smell would fill the entire house. "The mind is like a house with many rooms," the man continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "Most people only use the front parlor, never exploring the darker spaces. Sometimes someone comes along with the key to those locked doors." The lights flickered again, more violently this time. The brief moment of darkness, Chloe thought she saw something impossible. The man's shadow moving independently, reaching across the table toward her while his body remained perfectly still. "What do you want from me?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "Want?" His laugh was soft but wrong, like wind chimes made of bone. "I don't want anything, Chloe. I'm simply here to collect what was already promised." "Never promised you anything, didn't you?" His pale eyes seemed to glow in the harsh diner light. 3 months ago, when you were standing on the riverside bridge at midnight, looking down at the water. You made a very specific wish." The memory hit her like a physical blow. She had been on that bridge the night after she'd signed the divorce papers, when everything felt hopeless and the darkness seemed preferable to facing another empty day. She had whispered something into the wind, something desperate and foolish. "I'd give anything to forget." "That's not how I meant it," she said, her voice cracking. "The universe rarely concerns itself with how we mean things." He leaned forward, and she caught a scent like old books and cemetery dirt, only with what we say. The lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness, Chloe heard things that shouldn't exist. Whispered voices speaking in languages that predated civilization. The sound of pages turning in invisible books. Footsteps that seemed to come from every direction at once. The temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath misted in the air, and she felt something brush against her cheek with fingers that were far too cold to belong to anything living. "Don't fight it." The man's voice came from somewhere very close, though she couldn't tell if he was in front of her or behind her or somehow inside her own head. Forgetting can be a mercy. The darkness pressed against her like a living thing, and Chloe felt memories beginning to slip away. First, the recent ones, then older ones, cherished moments dissolving like sugar in rain. Kurt grandmother's face became blurry. Her first kiss faded to nothing. Even her own name started to feel foreign on her tongue. Then the lights came back on. Chloe blinked in the sudden brightness, disoriented and confused. She was sitting alone in her booth, her laptop open in front of her, an untouched piece of apple cinnamon pie growing cold on her plate. Across from her, the opposite booth sat empty, its red vinyl pristine and undisturbed. "You okay, honey?" Dolores appeared at her elbow, coffee pot in hand. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "The man," Chloe said weakly. "The man who was sitting there?" Dolores followed her gaze to the empty booth and frowned. "What man? That booth's been empty all night. You're the only customer I've had since midnight." Chloe stared at the vacant seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The vinyl showed no impression of someone having sat there, no warmth from a recently occupied space. Even the coffee cup was gone, leaving no trace that anyone had ever been there at all. But as she looked closer, she noticed something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. There, on the formica table in the empty booth, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were two small, wet rings, exactly the size and shape that a coffee cup would leave behind. And in the silence of the diner, with only the rain against the windows and the hum of the fluorescent lights above, Chloe realized with growing horror that she couldn't quite remember why she had come here tonight, or what she had been running from, and this thought terrified her most of all. Whether the memories she still possessed were entirely her own. Some things don't need light to hunt. David learned this the night he realized something had been watching him from the darkness of his own home for weeks. The power had been out for 3 hours when David's phone finally gave its death rattle, a pathetic buzz, followed by the screen going completely black. He'd been rationing the battery, using it sparingly to navigate between rooms, but now he was truly alone in the suffocating darkness of his 2-story house. The storm outside had knocked out power to half the neighborhood. Through his living room window, David could see the faint glow of emergency candles flickering in a few distant houses, but his own home felt like a void. He'd searched for candles earlier but came up empty, a consequence of rarely preparing for anything beyond his next Netflix binge. David sat on his couch, listening to the rain hammering against the windows. The house creaked around him, old wooden joints settling in ways that seemed louder, more pronounced in the absolute darkness. Every sound felt amplified: the whistle of wind through the attic, the gentle tick of his analog watch, the soft rumble of his empty stomach. It was then that he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, soft scraping, like fabric brushing against the wall, coming from somewhere upstairs. David's breath caught. He lived alone, had lived alone for the past 2 years since his divorce. The sound came again, deliberate and slow, followed by what might have been the creak of a floorboard. His heart began to pound. Maybe a tree branch had broken through an upstairs window. Maybe the wind was moving a curtain. Maybe. David fumbled for his phone, desperately pressing the power button. Nothing. He pressed it again, holding it longer. For a brief, merciful second, the screen flickered to life, just long enough to cast a weak circle of light around him before dying again. But in that moment of illumination, something had moved in his peripheral vision. He turned toward the corner of the room where he'd seen the movement, squinting into the impenetrable black. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive and watching. David held his breath, straining to hear anything over the sound of his own thundering heartbeat. Silence. Then another scrape, this time from downstairs. Closer. David forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady. He needed to get to the kitchen, find a knife, something. As he took a step forward, his foot caught the edge of the coffee table. The sharp pain shot through his shin, and he stumbled, pressing the phone's power button again in desperation. The screen blazed to life for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for David to see his living room in harsh, white detail, long enough to see the tall figure standing motionless in the far corner, its head turned toward him with an unnatural angle, as if it had been watching him the entire time. The phone died. David's scream caught in his throat. The figure had been impossibly tall, maybe 7 feet, with limbs that seemed too long for its frame. But it was the head that haunted him, tilted to one side like a curious dog, but wrong, so completely wrong in its stillness. David backed toward what he hoped was the hallway, his hands trembling as he felt along the wall. Behind him, he heard the soft whisper of movement, not footsteps, but something sliding across the hardwood floor. "Who's there?" David's voice cracked. "What do you want?" The movement stopped. In the silence that followed, David could swear he heard breathing that wasn't his own, slow, measured, like someone savoring the moment. He pressed his back against the wall and edged toward the kitchen, each step an eternity. The darkness felt thick, oppressive, as if it were pressing against his skin. His fingers finally found the kitchen door frame, and he slipped inside, immediately reaching for where he knew the knife block sat on the counter. His hands found empty space. The knives were gone. A soft sound behind him made David spin around. In the doorway, barely visible as a deeper shadow against the darkness, stood the figure. It hadn't made a sound approaching, simply appeared, as if the darkness itself had taken shape. David's phone somehow came to life one final time, perhaps the last gasp of its dying battery. The weak light illuminated the figure for a split second, and David saw what would haunt him forever. A face that wasn't quite human, with eyes that reflected the phone's light like mirrors, and a smile that stretched too wide across features that seemed to shift and blur even as he looked at them. But it was the realization that hit him hardest in that moment of terrible clarity. Those reflective eyes weren't just looking at him now. They had been tracking his every movement through the darkness, seeing him perfectly while he stumbled blind and helpless. The phone died for the last time. In the complete darkness that followed, David heard the thing take a step closer, then another. The sound wasn't quite footsteps, more like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Please," David whispered. The movement stopped just inches away from him. He could feel its presence, could sense its impossible height looming over him. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of dead leaves scraping against concrete. "You can't see me," it whispered, "but I've been watching you every night." David never found out what happened to his power that night, because the electricity was restored 3 hours later. His neighbors found him the next morning, sitting in his kitchen, staring at the corner where the figure had stood. He was holding his dead phone, pressing the power button over and over, muttering about needing light. David moved out the following week, but sometimes in his new apartment, when the lights go out unexpectedly, he swears he can still feel those mirror-bright eyes watching him from corners where the darkness seems just a little too deep. And sometimes, just sometimes, he hears that voice whispering from the shadows, "I found you again." And with that final story, we pull back from the abyss. For now, tales of ordinary lives brushing against the extraordinary, the terrifying, the unexplainable, from the shadow that mimics to the voice that calls from an empty house. We've seen tonight how thin the veil between our reality and a much darker one can be. These stories are not just fiction. They are born from real experiences, whispered in hushed tones, and shared to remind us that we are not always alone. And that's the most chilling thought, isn't it? Perhaps one of tonight's stories reminded you of something that happened to you, or to someone you know. A strange occurrence you've tried to forget. A noise in the night you rationalized away. A figure you saw for just a second. The details of your own brush with the darkness are what give this channel life. I invite you to leave your own story in the comments below. Let us know what you've seen in the shadows. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps these tales reach others who who need a reminder to check their locks at night. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. We have so many more stories to share, and you won't want to be left in the dark. Until next time, remember that you are not afraid of being alone. You are afraid of the bone-deep certainty that you are not.